I am way behind on thanking those who have helped keep the show going by using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show's notes to send me virtual coffee, including the stupendous Selena Blackwell, the picture-perfect Peggy Kilbridge, who loves hearing about her favorite city, and the Herculean Jorge Pardinez, who all support the podcast with a monthly donation. Thank you so very much. Ron M., who included the simple note, appreciate your work. Thanks, Ron. Steve Horn, who wrote, great work, Tommy. I've been an avid listener for more than a year, and I'm always impressed with your skill to successfully combine research and entertainment. So nice. Now I feel like I should send Steve money. My dude Bob M. with Master Fund USA bought me a bunch of coffees twice in the time that has taken me to thank him once. Boy, I'm slacking. Bob wrote, Tommy, I love your podcast, which get me through my workouts. However, the reason I'm sending this is not only to whet your whistle, but to acknowledge your pithy sense of humor. Sometimes the compliments are better than the coffees. Thank you, Bob. Jeff K. from West Lawn is a history major who enjoys the podcast. Jeff, I don't know where you're studying history, but a great spot is here in the greatest city in the world. Thanks for the coffee. My dude Frank Martinez, who has bought coffee before, simply wrote, my favorite podcast. Thanks, Frank. Curtis Wright, purveyor at Curtis Wright Maps, was also a recent supporter. Gracias, Curtis. And a mysterious someone has been enjoying the podcast while being laid up with a sprained ankle. Glad to make your recovery a little easier, I guess. JP sent a coffee. Much appreciated, JP. I should mention monthly supporter Jorge Pardinez included a really nice note, which included this. I've basically lived my whole life in Chicago and have barely explored it. The podcast has inspired me to look at buildings, places of interest in well-known areas, and research their history. Here's to giving back to a project that has sparked such a meaningful change in my life. Gosh, thanks for the kind words, Jorge. I'm glad some of my nerdy fascination with history has taken hold in you. You and all of you listening make all this effort worthwhile. And now, the Chicago White Sox have called 3 primary sites home since the team's founding in 1900, and each plot of earth carries layers of history older than the game of baseball. Today we're discussing the ground beneath the diamonds, a history of Chicago White Sox ballparks. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Don't worry if you're not into sports. This isn't really a sports episode. There will be a little sports talk, but this is more focused on the venues and the areas around them. Here we go. Long before Charles Comiskey drove a nail into a bleacher plank, the corner of 39th Street and Wentworth Avenue on Chicago's South Side was home to a very different sort of sporting institution. The Chicago Wanderers Cricket Club, founded in April of 1883, was a predominantly white middle-class social organization whose original home was Lincoln Park on the North Shore of Lake Michigan. By April of 1884, because Lincoln Park's public grounds were not always available, the club had relocated to a more permanent site at 37th Street and Indiana Avenue on the South Side. For nearly a decade, the Wanderers operated at this location as a genuine multi-sport club. By 1886, they had branched into rugby and soccer, and a tennis club that shared the grounds was absorbed into the organization. In 1887, a group of druggists and doctors who used the grounds formed a Wanderers baseball club, a telling detail that shows how the site had already become a multi-purpose sporting commons well before the professional game arrived. At its peak, the club counted 145 male and 24 female members. In 1893, the Wanderers merged with another club and relocated a few blocks south and west to 39th Street and Portland Avenue, which would later be renamed Wentworth Avenue, drawn by better access to the Wentworth Avenue streetcar line that ran directly downtown. The timing was significant. 1893 was the year of the World's Columbian Exposition, aka the World's Fair, and the area's expanded transit connections during the World's Fair made the new location especially attractive. The larger grounds at 39th and Portland Avenue, I'm just going to call it Wentworth, now allowed the club to host multiple events simultaneously. On November 24th, 1894, the grounds of the Wanderers Cricket and Athletic Club held an American football game between the Northwestern Dental College and the Hahnemann Medical College at 9:30 a.m., a soccer match at 11 a.m., and a cricket match at 2:30 p.m. between Scotch and Irish teams. By late 1894, the Wanderers had built a shed large enough to hold 5 curling rinks, and by January of 1900, a hockey rink was operational just weeks before everything changed. The area surrounding 39th and Wentworth in 1900 was a patchwork of working-class Chicago. To the west lay Bridgeport, originally called Hardscrabble, one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city, settled in 1836 primarily by Irish immigrants who came to dig the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Bridgeport had grown into a dense, tightly knit enclave of Irish, German, Polish, and Lithuanian families who worked the nearby Union stockyards, railroads, and small manufacturing operations. The White Sox, when they arrived, would find an immediate and enduring base of support among these industrial workers. To the northeast of the cricket fields lay the beginnings of what would become Bronzeville, a neighborhood that was just beginning to absorb the earliest waves of black migration from the south. The proximity of the old Wanderers' grounds to this racial borderland would later prove historically significant. Shoreling Park, which occupied the same site after the White Sox departed, would become a centerpiece of Black Chicago's cultural and sporting life. To the north and east of the site, the Armour Square neighborhood had been developing since the Civil War, when German and Irish immigrants settled the area to work in nearby industries. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, new building codes required brick construction in the central part of the city, raising costs and driving many working-class families further out to the edges of the brick area, including Armour Square. The neighborhood was characterized as a long, narrow strip, roughly 21 blocks long and only 4 or 5 blocks wide, that was wedged between rail lines and the south branch of the Chicago River. By 1899, Italian immigrants had arrived and established the Roman Catholic parish of Santa Maria Incoronata, adding another layer to Chicago's ethnic fabric. In early 1900, the Wanderers Cricket Club announced it was relocating to the former Chicago Cricket Club grounds on 79th Street. I mean, really, who knew cricket was such a thing here at one time? It was rumored that the 39th Street property would become the home of Charles Comiskey's new baseball club. Comiskey, born in 1859, was the son of an Irish immigrant alderman named Honest John Comiskey, who had come to Chicago 5 years earlier in 1854. Young Comiskey had spent years playing and managing in the professional leagues before becoming an owner. Now, when I hear of current-day players getting bounced around the country from city to city and team to team, I'm often amazed. Young Charles Comiskey had a similar path. He started a sports career in Midwestern semi-pro ball, pitching and playing in Chicago, then with the Dubuque Red Stockings in Dubuque, Iowa, where he first drew serious attention from professional clubs. In 1882, he joined the St. Louis Brown Stockings / Browns of the American Association in St. Louis, Missouri, and by 1883, he was their 23-year-old player-manager, leading them to 4 straight AA pennants in 1885 through 1888, and becoming one of the most prominent figures in that league. When the Players League formed in 1890, Comiskey jumped to the Chicago Pirates in Chicago, again serving as player-manager for the league's lone Chicago franchise. The Chicago Pirates played ball at Southside Park II, better known as Brotherhood Park, located on the northwest corner of 35th Street and Wentworth Avenue in Chicago's Douglas, Bridgeport area. The park took its name from the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players, the labor-style organization that launched the Players League in open revolt against National League ownership and the Reserve Clause, making Brotherhood Park a physical symbol of player resistance and experimentation in big league baseball. When the Players League collapsed after its lone 1890 season, the grounds were taken over by the National League's Chicago Club from 1891 to 1893, then disappeared from the city's ballpark map. After the Players League collapsed, Comiskey returned briefly to the St. Louis Browns in 1891, then moved on to the Cincinnati Reds in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he played and managed from 1892 to 1894, closing out his big league on-field career there. In late 1894, he shifted from on-field work into ownership, buying a Western League club in Sioux City, Iowa, then moved it to St. Paul, Minnesota as the St. Paul Saints. Finally, in 1900, he relocated that franchise to the south side of Chicago, rebranding it as the White Stockings, securing the lease on the old Wanderers grounds off 39th Street, and helped turn the renamed American League into a full-fledged major league. Comiskey became his own general contractor, throwing up a wooden grandstand surprisingly quickly. The financial pressures were immediate and colorful. His first payday found him with money in the bank, but none in his pocket to pay workers. And since it fell on Election Day, a day when banks were closed in Chicago, he sent his groundskeeper to every bar and grocery store in the neighborhood to break large bills. The ballpark opened April 21st, 1900, with painters still working on the fence as the first pitch was thrown, their paintbrushes swinging while the game proceeded. Some 5,200 fans showed up for the opener against the Milwaukee Brewers, who beat Chicago 5-4. The park was a single-deck wooden grandstand oriented to the northeast, with home plate near the intersection of 39th Street and Princeton Avenue. Its dimensions were unusual. Left field stretched a generous 398 feet, but the right field line ran a short 270 feet, cramped by the greenhouses of the J.F. Kidwell Company just beyond the fence. The greenhouse owner's anxiety about foul balls and home runs becoming a recurring problem appears in early newspaper accounts, and a factory across 39th Street suffered a broken plate glass window when a foul ball sailed out of the park in the first few weeks of operation. When the American League officially declared itself a major league in 1901, Southside Park hosted its inaugural game on April 24th, with the White Sox defeating the Cleveland Blues 8-2. 9,000 fans attended, and 4 days later, 15,000 packed the park for a Sunday rematch. While originally called the White Stockings, the team name was officially shortened to just White Sox in 1904. The park was upgraded continuously throughout the decade. Capacity grew from an initial 7,500-seat configuration to roughly 14,000 to 15,000 through repeated additions of box seats, bleachers, and pavilions. Comiskey added a luxury box atop the grandstand in 1901, though it was removed in 1907 after the Chicago Building Commission objected. The park's most glorious moment came in 1906 when the White Sox, dubbed the Hitless Wonders for their anemic batting average, shocked the heavily favored Chicago Cubs in the World Series, with games alternating between Southside Park and the Cubs' West Side grounds. The 1906 World Series remains the only all-Chicago World Series in history and drew enormous crowds to both venues, further cementing the Sox's grip on Southside identity. In February of 1907, it was announced Charles Comiskey had secured a building permit to make changes at Sox Park, including increasing the capacity for 25-cent and 50-cent seats, by 3,500 and increasing the number of 75-cent seats by 500. Also of note is that Comiskey requested the baseball diamond be raised. A partial fire in April of 1909 destroyed the first base pavilion, thought to have been caused by a cigar stub carelessly tossed away by an attendee of the afternoon game between Chicago and St. Louis. Fortunately, the park was nearly empty, and the fire was discovered by the caretaker, who alerted the fire department. Now, those of you who have listened to enough episodes know how much it still boggles my mind that they used to print the addresses of important Chicagoans, crime victims, you name it, an address would get printed. In the Chicago Tribune's reporting on the fire, it reads that Comiskey, quote, was at his home, 3952 Michigan Avenue, eating dinner when somebody telephoned him that the grandstand was burning. According to the story, he appeared unfazed about the fire and confident the series would continue the following day. Quote, there will be plenty of seats for all who come to the game, Comiskey proclaimed while eating strawberry shortcake, and it will only be a day or two until the burned portion will be replaced. As Comiskey suggested, repairs were quickly made and play continued the next day. By then, the writing was on the wall. Charles Comiskey had been eyeing a new permanent home for years, and the wooden Southside Park, aging, fire-prone, and increasingly unable to accommodate the crowds his team attracted, was just no longer adequate. 4.5 years earlier, on October 2nd, 1904, more than 30,000 fans jammed the park for a single regular season game, far beyond any safe or comfortable capacity. After signing the death warrant for Southside Park by purchasing new land on 35th Street in 1909, Comiskey continued to host games there while his new palace was built, and the final American League game at Southside Park was played on June 27, 1910, a 6-2 loss to Cleveland. So, what happened to the site of the old park? Well, before vacating Southside Park, Comiskey had the existing stands torn out and removed, taking the lumber with him. His stated excuse was that he did not want another ball club playing so close to his new venue. The strip ballpark sat vacant for a short time before a new chapter, arguably one of the most important in Chicago baseball history, began. In 1911, just 2 years after Comiskey's departure, a white Southside tavern owner named John Shorling leased the strip lot at 39th and Wentworth from Comiskey and entered into a partnership with Andrew Rube Foster, one of the greatest figures in the history of Negro League baseball. Shorling, who was widely described as Comiskey's son-in-law, had prior experience running ballparks and managing semi-professional teams. Foster, a towering figure physically and intellectually, had been a star pitcher and then manager of the Leland Giants and was determined to build a black baseball empire on the South Side. Together, Shorling and Foster rebuilt the 39th Street grounds from scratch. The new park cost approximately $15,000 and seated around 4,500 fans. When it opened on May 13, 1911, with the American Giants losing to the Spaldings in threatening weather before 3,000 spectators, it represented something genuinely new, a park with professional locker rooms and hot showers for home and visiting teams, operated by and for a black baseball team. Within weeks of opening, a Sunday crowd of 11,000 came to watch the American Giants at 39th and Wentworth, while only 9,000 showed up at Comiskey to watch the White Sox, and 6,000 attending the Cubs game. Comiskey had reportedly tried to warn Foster and Shorling that a black baseball team in Chicago could not succeed if they scheduled games on days when the White Sox were at home. Foster ignored this advice and turned out to be the wiser. Shorling Park sat at one of the most volatile racial boundaries in Chicago. Just a block away from the park lay the edge of what would become Bronzeville, the heart of the Great Migration's black settlement on Chicago's South Side. Tens of thousands of African Americans had been moving north from the Deep South since the First World War, drawn by industrial jobs in Chicago stockyards and factories. The resulting pressure on housing and neighborhoods at Armour Square and adjacent communities was immense. On July 17, 1919, 17-year-old Eugene Williams, a black teenager, was rafting with friends on Lake Michigan near 29th Street when they unknowingly drifted across an unwritten boundary that separated the white beach from the area where black swimmers were tolerated. A white beachgoer, 24-year-old George Stauber, began throwing rocks at the boys until William was struck, fell from the raft, and drowned. When the first responding officer, Daniel Callahan, refused to arrest Stauber, outrage over both the killing and the police response ignited 5 days of rioting on Chicago's South Side, leaving 23 black and 15 white residents dead. The National Guard had been called in to restore order, with troops bivouacked at Shoreline Park while the surrounding neighborhood was turned upside down. The American Giants canceled numerous home games and played many on the road in Detroit, only returning to 39th and Wentworth in September. Rube Foster built an extraordinary baseball dynasty at Shoreline Park. The American Giants won championships in 1914, 1916, 1917, and 1918, and in February 1920, Foster walked into a YMCA in Kansas City with 11 other men and created the Negro National League, the first sustained successful professional baseball league for black players in American history. The American Giants won the NNL pennant in 1920, 1921, and 1922, and captured the Negro World Series in 1926 in dramatic fashion, with the final 5 games played at Shoreline Park. Tragedy struck in 1926 when Foster suffered what appeared to be a nervous breakdown and was committed to an asylum in Kankakee, Illinois. With no written contract between Foster and Shoreline, Shoreline quietly took over the club, offering nothing to Foster's wife or children. Foster died in 1930 and was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1981. Shoreline sold the team to white racetrack owner William Trimble, who showed diminishing interest in the franchise. Ownership changed again in the early 1930s, and the park briefly became a dog racing park before Illinois Governor Henry Horner approved only those races without parimutuel betting, effectively killing the enterprise. Baseball returned under Robert Cole, who renamed the venue Cole's American Giants Park. But by then, the 20-something-year building was decaying, and attendance had begun its long decline as more and more black fans started attending games at Comiskey Park after Jackie Robinson-era integration reached the major leagues. On December 23, 1940, vandals set fire to the old wooden structure. The blaze, which started in the third base stand, spread quickly through the dilapidated building. Damage was estimated at between $2,000 and $8,000, and Horace Hall, the park's final owner, announced he would rebuild immediately, but never did. The second great fire at the ballpark was its last. As one historian noted, it was a historic landmark in the history of Negro League baseball, yet no one sheds tears when Shoreline Park burned, as there was universal agreement that the old wooden ballpark had outlived its usefulness. The rubble was cleared, and for several years the lot sat vacant. In 1944, the Chicago Housing Authority purchased the site to build public housing for black war industry workers. The area's population had shifted entirely from the white cricket enthusiasts of 1893 and the mixed-race crowds of the 1910s to the black residents of wartime Bronzeville. Wentworth Gardens opened in 1947 as a low-rise development of 422 units, designed by the firm Lobel and Schlossman. The development was initially praised as one of the best public housing communities in Chicago and provided a stable home for thousands of families throughout the 1940s, 50s, and most of the 1960s. In the later 1960s, CHA screening of new tenants became lax. Criminal elements moved in, and gang activity by the Gangster Disciples and Black P-Stones intensified throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. The complex earned a grim nickname, Murder Town, as homicides spiked. By the mid-2000s, the CHA's plan for transformation targeted Wentworth Gardens, but local activists successfully fought demolition. Instead, the complex was renovated by 2007. Today, Wentworth Gardens stands as a 344-unit housing project, and at the northeast corner of 39th Street and Wentworth Avenue, a historical marker erected in 1999 commemorates the life of Rube Foster, but there is no tribute to the ballpark itself. If the 39th Street grounds had a relatively dignified pre-baseball history as a gentleman's sports club, the land on which Charles Comiskey built his new Grand Park had a decidedly humbler origin. The 14-acre tract at the corner of 35th Street and Shields Avenue in the Armour Square neighborhood had served as a city dump. Comiskey purchased the lot in 1909 for $100,000 from the estate of John Wentworth, a newspaper publisher and two-time Chicago mayor. After securing the land, Comiskey commissioned architect Zachary Taylor Davis, a graduate of the Armour Institute, today the Illinois Institute of Technology, who toured ballparks across the country with White Sox pitcher Ed Walsh in preparation for the design. Davis was reportedly most impressed with Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, which opened in 1909, and adapted its double-deck grandstand configuration for the Chicago design. Davis would later design Weigman Field, later called Cubs Park and now Wrigley Field, in 1914, making him responsible for both of Chicago's great baseball cathedrals. Ground was broken on February 15, 1910, and construction proceeded at lightning speed. The Green Cornerstone, a nod to the heavily Irish South Side neighborhoods from which Comiskey expected to draw, was laid on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1910, by architect Davis himself, who reportedly knelt on a piece of sod imported from Ireland for the occasion. A crowd of Bridgeport Irish gathered to watch the ceremony, which had an almost devotional character. Davis even secured the lucky brick with several tiers of masonry stacked on top in case anyone tried to claim it as a souvenir in the night. While a labor strike by local steelworkers threatened to delay the opening, the park was ready by mid-season. White Sox Park, as it was officially named at first, opened on July 1, 1910, with engraved invitations going out to a motorcade of Chicago dignitaries, including Mayor Fred Bussey, Amos Alonzo Stagg, and even Charles Murphy of the rival Cubs. Ed Walsh, whose pitching heroics had been so central to the White Sox's success, and whose design input had shaped the park's generous outfield dimensions through the first game, and lost to the St. Louis Browns 2-0. From the beginning, Comiskey Park was referred to as the baseball palace of the world. The park seated approximately 32,000 at opening, a record for any stadium in the major leagues at the time, and was only the third concrete and steel stadium in the majors to have been built since 1909. The foul line stretched 362 feet from home plate, and center field was an intimidating 420 feet away, dimensions that reflected Comiskey and Walsh's joint philosophy that home games should be honestly earned. Comiskey had been offered the option of a cantilevered grandstand without obstructing columns, but when he learned that this would add $350,000 to the construction cost, he vetoed the idea. The post stayed and would remain a source of complaint from fans sitting behind them for most of the park's 80-plus year history. The venue was renamed Comiskey Park by 1913 and quickly became the cornerstone of Southside identity. Comiskey had deliberately chosen the location With his potential fan base in mind, the ethnic Irish of Bridgeport, Canaryville, Washington Park, and Back of the Yards were his people, both in sentiment and genealogy. The Black Sox scandal of 1919 cast a long shadow over Comiskey Park and its owner. 8 White Sox players, including the legendary outfielder Shoeless Joe Jackson, were accused of deliberately losing the 1919 World Series in exchange for payments from gamblers. Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis banned all 8 players for life. Charles Comiskey's role in the scandal remains debated by historians. Some accounts suggest he knew of the fix early and held up player checks, while others note that the 1919 White Sox actually had the second highest payroll in the major leagues. The scandal, however, devastated the franchise's competitive fortunes for decades. Local baseball historian / author Jacob Pomremke shared this White Sox story on his webpage, link in the show's notes, about which I was unaware. Late on the evening of April 22nd, 1923, a bomb exploded outside Comiskey Park at 35th and Shields, destroying a hot dog concession stand and shattering office windows above the main entrance, a blast heard over a mile away. 5 days earlier, a bomb had been discovered, but not detonated, outside Cubs Park, and later that October, another bomb destroyed Cubs Park's ticket booths. The White Sox pointed to an ongoing labor dispute. The park had been repainted by workers who had been brought in under a Landis Award wage settlement that union members were picketing. The bombings were never solved. Oh, almost forgot this funny story about the park and its former use as a dump. According to the book Lost Ballparks, A Celebration of Baseball's Legendary Fields by author Lawrence Ritter, in the 1930s, White Sox shortstop Luke Appling noticed something hard beneath his foot in the infield and kicked at the dirt, thinking it was a rock. "I started digging with my spikes," he recalled years later, and lo and behold, I uncovered a blue and white tea kettle. Quite an antique. The ground crew had to fill in the hole before play could continue. Now, keep in mind, this was 25 years after the new ballpark was built on the site of the old dump. This must have been some pretty hasty construction back in 1910. The most significant physical transformation of Comiskey Park came after the 1926 season, when Charles Comiskey commissioned Zachary Taylor Davis to double-deck the outfield pavilions along the foul lines and close the park with a high center field bleacher section. The impetus was less the team's mediocre performance than the drawing power of Babe Ruth and the Yankees, whose visits to Chicago sold out the park, and the continuing popularity of the City Series against the Cubs. Construction proceeded over the winter of 1926-1927, and although not all seats were installed for the home opener on April 20th, 1927, the full facility was ready for the Yankees' first visit in May. Lou Gehrig hit the first home run in the new pavilion, a grand slam off Ted Lyons, and Vice President Charles G. Dawes was in attendance. The expansion raised official capacity to approximately 52,000, though the Chicago Fire Department limited seating to that figure. The park's new dimensions, 352 feet on each foul line, 440 feet to center field, made it one of the most spacious parks in the majors, a true pitcher's sanctuary where home runs were hard-earned rarities. The outfield stands rose 70 feet, and hitting a ball over the roof required a drive traveling at least 474 feet, an accomplishment achieved about as rarely as a no-hitter. On July 6, 1933, Comiskey Park became the birthplace of a tradition that endures to this day, the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. The event was conceived by Arch Ward, sports editor of the Chicago Tribune, as part of Chicago's Century of Progress World's Fair, celebrating the city's centennial, and was intended to be a one-time event to boost Depression-era morale. Approximately 49,000 fans jammed into the park to watch the American League defeat the National League 4-2, with Babe Ruth hitting the first All-Star home run in the third inning. The game was such a success that it became an annual institution. Charles Comiskey died at the age of 72 on October 26, 1931, leaving the team to his son, J. Lewis Comiskey. Charles Comiskey is buried at Calvary Cemetery in Evanston, Illinois. J. Lewis Comiskey was only 45 years old when his father died and had worked in the Sox organization since 1910. He guided the team through the Depression years until his own death from heart disease on July 18, 1939, at the age of 53. Control then passed to his widow, Grace Comiskey, who on March 4, 1941, was formally elected president of the White Sox by the team's board of directors, becoming the first woman president of an American League baseball team. Grace ran the franchise until her death on December 10, 1956, overseeing the park through World War II and into the post-war era of expanded attendance. After Grace Comiskey's death in 1956, her son Chuck Comiskey and daughter Dorothy Rigney fought a prolonged legal battle over control of the franchise. Chuck received a 46% stake, but ultimately lost the power struggle, selling his stock to a group headed by insurance magnate William Bartholomew, which then sold the club to Bill Veeck in 1959. Veeck's first ownership stint coincided with the White Sox's 1959 American League pennant, their first since the Black Sox era, and he used his characteristic showmanship to transform Comiskey Park into an entertainment destination, most notably by installing the famous exploding scoreboard in 1960. Now, the scoreboard really deserves its own dedicated section. Bill Veeck was allegedly inspired by a pinball jackpot scene in the 1948 James Cagney film, The Time of Your Life. This character in the film was always playing pinball machines, Veeck shared with the Tribune in April of 1960. Toward the finish, he finally hit the jackpot, and there was the darndest racket and flashing of lights you ever heard or saw. To give White Sox home runs the dramatic treatment Veeck felt they deserved, a $300,000, nearly $3.4 million today, 130-foot wide monster scoreboard was unveiled April 28, 1960, featuring 9 columns of multicolored spinning pinwheels, flashing strobe lights, sirens, locomotive collision sounds, simulated horse hoofbeats, and fireworks erupting from a platform behind the board. It was officially christened on May 1st, 1960, when Al Smith hit a 2-run homer off Jim Bunning in the first inning. Opposing managers and purists lost their minds. Former Sox manager Jimmy Dykes said, "If I was a pitcher whose home run ball had started that 4th of July celebration, I'd fire my next pitch at the head of the next hitter." Casey Stengel and the Yankees countered by having bat boys hold up sparklers in the dugout whenever a Yankee homered, to which Veeck responded by adding a Roman candle aimed at the opposing dugout. The monster board didn't always work as intended. Once the Sox hit back-to-back homers, David Condon, a writer for the Tribune, wrote in 1982, and the scoreboard had not been reloaded to salute the second blast. Another time, a flaming rocket landed on second base, bringing out the field crew with extinguishers. Bill Veeck also had the park painted white, obscuring Davis's original green brick in the process. He also knocked bricks out of the left field wall to create a screened picnic area where fans could sit at picnic tables and still have a view of the game. Another Veeck idea: the first Major League Baseball team to put players' names on the backs of their jerseys was the Chicago White Sox in 1960. On March 13, 1960, Bill Veeck's White Sox unveiled road uniforms with player names on the back during a spring exhibition game versus Cincinnati, marking the first time an MLB club used names on uniforms rather than just numbers. Suffering from health issues, Veeck sold the team in 1961 to Arthur Allen Jr., a Chicago brokerage executive. In a notable near miss, Arthur Allen considered selling the White Sox to a Milwaukee group that would have moved the team to Wisconsin, but instead transferred his stake to his brother John in 1969. John Allen sold his interest in the team back to Vec, who repurchased the team on December 16, 1975, in an extraordinary second act that produced some memorable years for the White Sox. No history nerd White Sox story is complete without mentioning disco demolition. During a twilight doubleheader against the Detroit Tigers on July 12, 1979, White Sox marketing enlisted anti-disco Chicago radio personality Steve Dahl of WLUP for a promotion. If fans brought a disco record to the park, admission was just 98 cents. The team hoped for 20,000 fans. At least 50,000 showed up, thousands more sneaking in after gates were closed. Records were thrown frisbee style from the stands all game long. Between games, Dahl detonated a crate of records in center field, and the explosion left a crater in the grass while tens of thousands stormed the field, setting bonfires, destroying the batting cage, and even stealing bases. Riot police cleared the field, 39 people were arrested, and the White Sox forfeited the second game to the Tigers. Vec's group lacked sufficient resources, and on January 29, 1981, just 5 years after his second stint overseeing the White Sox, American League owners unanimously approved the sale of the White Sox to a syndicate led by 44-year-old Skokie real estate developer Jerry Reinsdorf and television executive Eddie Einhorn for approximately $19 to $21 million. By the time of the Reinsdorf purchase, the Arbor Square neighborhood surrounding Comiskey Park had undergone significant transformation. The construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway in the early 1960s was perhaps the single most disruptive event in the neighborhood's modern history. The expressway's original route would have cut through Bridgeport along Normal Avenue, directly through Mayor Richard J. Daley's own neighborhood. In 1956, Mayor Daley and the City Council moved the route to Wentworth Avenue along the eastern edge of Arbor Square and Fuller Park instead, displacing residents and businesses in a community that had already been battered by urban renewal. This was not an accident. The Dan Ryan Expressway, when completed, functioned as a concrete wall between Daley's white ethnic Bridgeport and the expanding black neighborhoods to the east, and it displaced over 81,000 people across the south and west sides, of whom 64% were black, despite black residents comprising only 23% of the city's total population at the time. The expressway cut Chinatown in half with the interchange at I-55 and effectively walled off eastern Arbor Square. The population of Arbor Square, which had stood at 21,450 in 1930, dropped to just 10,801 by 1990, a decline of nearly 50% over 6 decades. When Reinsdorf and Einhorn bought the White Sox in 1981, one of the first priorities was a major Comiskey Park overhaul, adding skybox-style luxury suites, new premium seats close to the infield, and a state-of-the-art video scoreboard that could show animations, instant replays, and expanded statistics. In 1982, the White Sox used newly available computer data to conclude that old Comiskey Park's deep dimensions were costing them home runs, especially on their own long fly balls. Rather than move the concrete outfield walls or install a temporary interfence, which ownership thought looked terrible, they decided to move the entire playing field, including home plate, the mound, and infield, about 8 feet closer to the existing fences. That shift shortened center field from 409 to 401 feet, and the corners from 352 to 341 feet, while simultaneously raising the outfield walls to keep the park from becoming one where home runs are too easy to hit. Executing the plan was a massive off-season construction project overseen by groundskeeper Roger Bossard, involving cranes to move the towering foul poles, stripping and relaying sod, redoing irrigation and drainage lines, and rebuilding the mound in a new spot. The change not only nudged fly balls a bit farther into the seats, helping power hitters and even contributing to Fred Lyman's famous 1983 All-Star Game Grand Slam, but also allowed Reinsdorf and Einhorn to add 4 premium rows of box seats behind home plate, boosting revenue as attendance surged during the Sox's 1983 division-winning season. Old Comiskey Park, with its aging infrastructure and limited premium seating capacity, was increasingly unable to compete with newer parks being built elsewhere. In 1983, just 2 years after acquiring the Sox, Jerry Reinsdorf began publicly describing Comiskey Park as disintegrating and made veiled and then explicit threats to move the franchise to St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, the story of how Chicago obtained a replacement for old Comiskey Park is as much a story of political maneuvering and manufactured crisis as it is a story of genuine urban planning. As Reinsdorf later admitted in a 1995 Cigar Aficionado interview, quote, "A savvy negotiator creates leverage. People had to think we were going to leave Chicago." In 1983, he announced that if Illinois legislators did not fund a new stadium, the White Sox would be forced out of business or out of the city. In 1984, the White Sox quietly purchased 140 acres of land in the western Chicago suburb of Addison, making the possibility of a suburban move more realistic. Governor Jim Thompson and Chicago Mayor Harold Washington collaborated on legislation to create a special purpose authority for stadium construction, but the first bill failed to pass the General Assembly. A subsequent version passed, creating the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority, or the ISFA, which was authorized to issue $120 million in revenue bonds to fund a new 45,000-seat stadium. The legislation finally passed in 1987, and Governor Thompson signed it behind home plate at Comiskey Park on July 6, 1988, flanked by Reinsdorf and Mayor Eugene Sawyer. The governor announced, "I want to send the message that Chicago is the most American of all cities, and Illinois is the most American of all states." Throughout its roughly 80-plus years, the original Comiskey became the focal point of the working-class South Side, hosting NFL games for the Chicago Cardinals, championship boxing matches, and a variety of civic events. Comiskey would be home ground for soccer teams, Chicago Mustangs and Chicago Sting, and was the site of the final edition of the Soccer Bowl. The park served as a major concert venue, hosting the Beatles for 2 shows in August of 1965. Rock festivals in the late 1970s, including events like the August 5th, 1978 Summer Jam World Series of Rock Bill, which featured Aerosmith, Foreigner, AC/DC, Frank Marino, and Mahogany Rush, and Walter Egan before a crowd of more than 60,000. In October 1984, the Jacksons' Victory Tour played multiple nights at Comiskey, with full stadium pop shows built around Michael Jackson's peak solo-era material. A groundbreaking ceremony for the new Comiskey was held on May 7, 1989, with Mayor Richard M. Daley and Governor James Thompson in attendance. The new Comiskey Park was to be built directly across 35th Street from the old one, a decision with profound implications for both the construction timeline and the fate of the old structure. The old park continued to host games through the entire 1990 season, with the final game played on September 30th, 1990. Demolition of Old Comiskey Park began on April 3rd, 1991 at 10 a.m. Chicago radio personality Jonathan Brandmeier of WLUP-FM broadcast live as the first 6,500-pound wrecking ball struck the park, turning the demolition into a media event. A crowd of onlookers booed with each strike of the ball, and by late September the historic structure was razed. One of the final elements to be removed was the monster scoreboard. The land that the old Comiskey once occupied was converted into a parking lot for its successor across the street. To many fans and preservationists, leveling the old park where 80 years of history had stood and turning it into a parking lot was viewed as an act of cultural vandalism. Critics noted that Reinsdorf's vision for the surrounding neighborhood was a stadium surrounded by parking, a design philosophy that deliberately funneled fans through the stadium gates and away from local bars, restaurants, and businesses. The new Comiskey Park opened on April 18, 1981, and attracted a club record 2,934,154 fans in its first season. The park was built for $137 million, slightly more than $332 million today, and was owned from the outset by the ISFA, meaning the state of Illinois, not the White Sox, owned the building. When the new park opened in 1991, the fireworks tradition was preserved. The center field scoreboard was designed as a direct replica of Eck's exploding board, complete with working pinwheels that spin and light up after every White Sox home run, with actual fireworks launching from behind it. Melrose Pyrotechnics, the Melrose Park company that handled nearly all of the fireworks since 1960, merged with the LaPorte County, Indiana-based Pyrotechnica in 2021 and continued to handle fireworks for the Sox. The new park features an old-time facade with arches and over 40,000 unobstructed view seats. The architect was the firm Populous, then operating as HOK Sport, the dominant sports stadium design company of its era. Also bridging the old park and the new was Nancy Faust, the White Sox organist who is credited with two of the most durable innovations in baseball's audio presentation. Walk-up music. She began playing individual theme songs for players, starting with Jesus Christ Superstar for Dick Allen, and popularizing the singing of Na Na, Hey Hey, Kiss Him Goodbye when opposing pitchers were pulled, a tradition now used in stadiums worldwide. Faust was hired straight out of a luncheonette gig in 1970 after the Sox's GM heard her play at a Chicago event and offered her a job on the spot. When she first took her seat in the bleachers, a petition was circulating in the grandstands. Some fans didn't think a woman should have the job. She played for 41 seasons across both Comiskey Parks, finally retiring in 2010. An organist booth in the current park is named in her honor, and the team still features live organ music at select games. Nancy Faust returned for a 6-game stint spread across 6 Sunday home games from May through August 2025. They were all Coca-Cola family Sunday dates tied into the club's 125th anniversary celebration. One of the more beloved and eccentric relics of the old Comiskey era that is part of the current Sox Park is the outdoor shower in the center field bleacher concourse. During Bill Veeck's second ownership stint in the late 1970s, he had an outdoor shower installed, which offered fans a cool down on hot Chicago summer days. The shower became so embedded in Southside culture that when old Comiskey was torn down, it was physically relocated and reinstalled on the outfield concourse of the new park, where it still operates today. It is sponsored by the Chicagoland Plumbing Council, and images of Harry Carey using it are among the most memorable photographs of the old park era. The stadium's early years were not without criticism. The upper deck is notoriously steep, earning the park a reputation among fans for vertigo-inducing sightlines in the upper tiers. The surrounding neighborhood remained largely undeveloped, with Reinsdorf's parking-centric design philosophy creating a buffer between the stadium and the surrounding residential blocks of Armour Square. The Wentworth Gardens housing project continued to sit just south of the new park, and the racial demographics of the immediate neighborhood, predominantly black and working class, contrasted sharply with the historically white ethnic identity of the fan base that Comiskey Park had cultivated most of its history. In January 2003, the ISFA and the Chicago White Sox sold naming rights to U.S. Cellular, a telecommunications company, for $68 million over 20 years, or roughly $3.4 million per year. The park became U.S. Cellular Field, widely nicknamed the Cell by fans. Notably, U.S. Cellular later exited the Chicago telecommunications market, but continued paying for the naming rights until the agreement was bought out. In November 2016, a new 13-year naming rights agreement was announced with Guaranteed Rate, a Chicago-based mortgage company. The terms were lower than the U.S. Cellular deal, approximately $2 million per year, or $20.4 million over the first 10 years, below the MLB average of $4.4 million per year among parks with naming rights partners. The park became Guaranteed Rate Field on November 1st, 2016. Fan attempts to generate a nickname produced suggestions including The Rate, G-Rate Field, and others, though none achieved the organic staying power of the Cell. In December 2024, the naming rights were shortened and the park was officially renamed Rate Field, its current designation. Beginning in the 2000s, the Armour Square neighborhood began a modest but meaningful renaissance, driven in part by Chinese investment in the adjacent Chinatown neighborhood to the north. The development of Chinatown Square and the construction of several apartment buildings, restaurants, and commercial spaces in the northern section of Armour Square attracted new residents and investment. The proximity to McCormick Place and Guaranteed Rate Field, as it was then known, contributed to renewed development interest. A 2014 survey found that 46.6% of Armour Square's household spoke Chinese at home, reflecting the dramatic demographic shift in the neighborhood's northern half. In 2021, home sales in Armour Square grew 93.8% compared to 2020, among the highest growth rates in the entire city. The southern portion of the community area, however, remained overwhelmingly African American, with one census tract recording 99% black residents. The neighborhood continued to reflect the stratified geography that the Dan Ryan Expressway had helped cement decades earlier. In 2025, then 89-year-old Jerry Reinsdorf, who has owned the White Sox since 1981, reached a long-term investment agreement with billionaire minority owner Justin Ishbia that sets up the framework for Ishbia to potentially acquire Reinsdorf's controlling stake between 2029 and 2034, while Reinsdorf remains the team's controlling owner in the meantime. Reinsdorf, by the way, purchased the team for approximately $19 to $21 million in 1981. The franchise is now valued at over $1.8 billion. The White Sox's current lease for Rate Field with the ISFA expires after the 2029 season. Since at least 2024, Reinsdorf's organization has been exploring the possibility of a new stadium in Chicago's South Loop, presenting renderings of a ballpark village concept at a site known as the 78, 60-plus acres at Clark and Roosevelt Road, owned by Related Midwest. Those plans were complicated when the Chicago Fire Football Club broke ground in early 2026 on a privately funded 22,000-seat soccer stadium at the 78 site, consuming a substantial portion of the available land for that development. In March 2026, Crane's Chicago Business reported that Shore Capital, Ishbia's private equity firm, was nearing an agreement to purchase the 47-acre Amtrak 14th Street coach yard in the South Loop, situated across the Chicago River from the 78. If the deal is completed, it would give the incoming White Sox ownership a serious land foothold for a new ballpark-anchored development along the south branch of the Chicago River. Amtrak, for its part, is reportedly in negotiations to relocate its maintenance operations to a site near Rate Field's existing parking lots. The prospect of a South Loop Stadium would mark a dramatic departure from the Southside identity that has defined White Sox baseball for more than 125 years. The move would be from the working-class precincts of Armour Square and Bridgeport to the luxury real estate corridor between the Loop and the emerging development zones along the river. If you're looking for signs of the old Comiskey Park, there is a memorial home plate marker from the old park that resides just north of 35th Street, not far from the Gate 5 ramp that crosses over 35th Street. The address of both the old at 324 West 35th Street and the current 333 West 35th Street. The circular old Comiskey home plate marker in Lot B, north of Guaranteed Rate Field, is officially described by the White Sox and historical marker databases as marking the original home plate location, roughly 503 feet north of the current plate. Not to be a spoiler, but independent researchers who have overlaid sand-borne fire maps and aerial photos onto the modern-day site say later measurements show the marker is off by an estimated 10 to 20 feet from the precise historical spot. It's good enough for photo ops, but not quite a survey-grade recreation of the exact plate position. All I can say is there are few events I enjoy more than sitting at a ballpark, enjoying a hot dog or two, maybe a cold one or three, and watching the White Sox play baseball. Thanks for listening to today's episode about the various White Sox ballparks over the years. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by me, Tommy Henry. As always, if you have questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to items related to Chicago's amazing history in the show's notes if you or someone you know is a history nerd like me who would like to learn more. Anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no additional cost to you. Check out the Chicago History Podcast social media pages for articles and pictures related to this episode and past episodes posted throughout the week. Much of the original art for the Chicago History Podcast used on these social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Crushing it, Johnny! If you need creative work done, you'll find no one better. Send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.